Hello and welcome back to Av Imperator Productions. Today we're going to be taking a look at the ancient Byzantines, their art, and how they saw beauty and aesthetics. This is a little bit of a hard time to draw these sort of inferences and ideas from because, as I talked about in my previous video on Byzantium, this was a very dark time, not just for Western culture, but for the world at large. There was huge groups of militarily advanced nomads moving around just for the sake of taking further slaves and killing. There was huge changes in the atmosphere, in the environment. The world got cold, people moved south. There was a lot of destruction, new ideas, and a lot of conflagration in this time period, which led to a scarcity of resources, a scarcity of knowledge, and a scarcity of written records. It also doesn't help that a lot of the Byzantine lands became part of a separate culture which sort of tried to look at things differently. So we want to take a look specifically at the art and the way that the Byzantines thought of art. There's some important ideas we need to go over before we can dive right into the Byzantines, though. One of these being the rise of Christianity and their impact on the arts. Christianity and many other ideologies of the time led to questions about art, how it could be produced, and why it should be produced. This really isn't anything new. In our modern society today, we have huge structures that tell us what kind of art we're allowed to like. When someone crosses the line, they make sure to charge them fines. There are certain topics you're allowed to discuss. There are certain topics you are not allowed to discuss. This has been the same all throughout time. We have grown a lot in what the topics of art can be and which concepts are allowed to flourish and be thought about. But at this time, art was very condensed. It didn't allow a lot of outside information, and most art was brought down from either a priest class or from some sort of ruling organization. There was also this concept that a lot of the older art, especially that the Romans were engaged in, the sculpture, the architecture, the large displays of artistic prowess, became very hard to come by. You needed a quarry somewhere to gather the marble, you needed lots of workers to cut it, you needed even more to move it, you had to buy it all in one piece, and then you had to, in one go, make the artistic piece you were trying to. This is a very difficult process, and it takes huge supply lines, it takes lots of trade and infrastructure, it takes a lot of the benefits of a large structured society where there was no large structured society in about the mid-first millennium AD. So a lot of these problems led to a lessening of the art, and yet the Byzantines did look at these problems and overcome. And as the Romans, we'll take a look at the Pax Romana a little bit in this episode, which was the Roman peace. As trade flourished, and a lot of these ideas made it so that art could be a lot more accessible, they narrowed their focus and they looked specifically at the human condition and what it meant to be alive and to react in the world. As times became more and more tough, the art sort of lifted from this concept of looking at the individual and his struggle to looking at the world and the struggle that life itself goes through. The stylization and the conception of art did a sort of 180 from the old Roman to the new Byzantine, and we're going to take a little bit closer look at that now. So to get a little bit closer perspective on the 180 difference between the Roman and the Byzantine periods, I want to take a little look at their society and how they developed specific ways of coping with their new reality. So as the Roman era around 476 ended, the Byzantines began to flourish in the 6th, 7th, 8th century AD. They did have a little bit of a rough spot there in the end, we'll get to that. The new era they found themselves in was very damaging and very upsetting. This also came with a new ideology, Christianity, which looked to expand beyond the central person and tap into a greater spirit or a greater truth than beyond simply what the material can have available. These can most definitely be seen in two construction techniques areas. In the West, in Greece, they were called necropolis, and in Rome, they were called catacombs. So what is a necropolis? Literally, translated from Greek, it is a city of the dead, polis, and necro. And these were essentially places underneath where the citizens lived, tunnels, sort of, that could be used to house the dead, to house venerated objects. They came to have lots of purposes. So why would this happen exactly? The necropolis was a safe place to come and to store, especially the bodies of your ancestors. One important facet of Christianity at the time was the way that it worked. The local customs and ideas of the different groups of people that already existed into its own framework. The Romans did not bury their dead. For the most part, they burned them, but they still had a very strict sense of what was called ancestor worship. Now, essentially what this meant was they would venerate their previous ancestors. If you were in an illustrious house, you did your best that you could to remember your previous lines, to remember your grandfather, your great-grandfather, their contributions, and to strive to be as good as them, or better, hopefully. This melded well with the new Christian idea, which centered around burials, and at the same time, while the barbarians and the Germans and the Alemanis and the Huns and everyone else was rampaging around, burning, killing, pillaging, and looting, having buildings and things on top of the ground that could be very easily seen, spotted, and raided wasn't the best idea. So they built down instead. They first, since a lot of their nice, precious things had been taken, a lot of their trade routes had been destroyed, and a lot of their luxuries had been removed, the number one thing that they had was their ancestors, their dead, the people around them who were no longer there. Death became a very central tenet of Western culture around this time, and the attempt to avoid or to push out of memory the concept of death was completely done away with. These people's lives were centered around this concept, and the dead around you would have been put into these catacombs or these necropolis, where their bodies could be stored and where certain objects of affection could be put, and eventually they came to become much more popular hangout spots. There's some speculation that originally Christians went into the catacombs to pray to get away from persecution, which is probably true, but this would not have been the primary purpose of the catacombs and the necropolis themselves. They originally would have housed dead people, but if a saint or a very particularly powerful person was dead and buried, and you agreed with that person's ideas or concepts, you would want to be dead and buried in a similar spot there. So you would frequent that area, those catacombs would be expanded, and as more illustrious and more famous and powerful and influential people were buried and marked in these spots, these catacombs became sort of centers of migration and coming together of people who had similar ideas and beliefs towards the person who had been buried there. This led to a very interesting death-centered life, where these people's number one objects would have been tied to the dead and the belongings of those dead people. So let's take a little bit closer look at these catacombs, or necropolis, and see exactly why it is these came to be built and exist. We do have some subterranean construction in our societies today. We have subways for transportation. We have sewage for moving material that we don't want in our homes somewhere else. We have some water and some electricity, a lot of utilities, and a lot of functional aspects of our society actually take place underground. And this is actually a concept that extends from these old catacombs. The catacomb was not simply a graveyard. It wasn't a place that you went just to stick a dead body and salute once or twice a month or year even. It was much more centered in how the people saw their lives and their society. The necropolis sure would have housed these dead bodies. It also would have housed small artifacts and icons, concepts which came into use a lot in Eastern Christianity, where it was an image that didn't necessarily remind you of a story, but of a feeling and a concept that seemed almost to be ethereal and to sort of try and drag that into reality. So a lot of the larger objects, the loot as it would have been seen from the northern invaders, would have been taken and moved away. So these catacombs were for safety, they were for the preservation of the society and the concepts of the old ways, and they were also for moving forward. These new art forms that would come into play in the medieval times, specifically mosaics, which we'll talk about in a little bit, were first seen in a lot of these catacombs. And a lot of the new art forms that sprung forward from the Western culture's dive into the concept of death and the integration of death into their society would first be seen in these catacombs. So why would you build a catacomb? Originally, if you were part of a noble or illustrious house in Rome, you would build up your palatial home, your residence in the city. It would be seen, there would be a lot of wealth accumulated there. But as a lot of raids and time went on, cities became smaller and people became less populous. It became less of a good idea to have a lot of wealth and splendor accumulated in one spot where everyone could see it. So instead of adorning yourself and your living house with all of these objects, you would adorn your past and your ancestors with these accoutrements of wealth and of belonging in the material world. So you would take the material excess that you had and use it to venerate the dead. And this sort of showed the connection between the living as a bridge of existence between no existence and death, a very short glimpse into the extreme brutality of the world, where you have very little time to actually get up and do something. The most lavish of catacombs would actually be these storing rooms for the wealthy and their ancestors. As the catacombs and the necropolis became more popular, it became a more centered part of the culture, and death became entrenched in the West, they became less of a graveyard, as you could put it, and more of a societal linchpin, where these people would come not only to venerate their elders, as a good Roman would, but also to remind themselves of their Christianity, to find a quiet place to be, and to store material wealth that they may not be able to put elsewhere under a label which didn't promote themselves as being overly vain. If you were accumulating resources to adorn the remembrance of your ancestors, it didn't look like you were accumulating them for yourself. So as the concept of death and dying and the concept of outside ideas became larger and larger in the Byzantine Empire, the catacombs became more and more entrenched, their art began to flourish, and the people began to look at them not as an extension of a negative aspect of life, but as an extension of a necessary aspect of life. So I want to look a little bit at the transformation of art from the Roman period to the Byzantine. There was an enormous shift. In fact, the aesthetic almost did a complete 180. They sort of ran up to the limit of what they could do with the technology and know-how at the time. We saw in the last video, the Roman copy artists were very good at taking ideas and bringing them in. But I've also spoken previously about how Rome and Greek thought had two very different veins. The Greeks liked to think a little bit more about abstract ideas and concepts which didn't exist materially, and the Romans were much more down to earth. They liked feelings and concepts that were in human nature and that could be easily seen and recorded. So when the Roman society shifted from Italy to Greece, and when the Byzantines became the main people calling themselves Romans and continuing the tradition, there was a very interesting shift in the way that art was displayed and developed, and this can be seen mostly in the way that they portrayed their art. During the time of the Romans, the Pax Romana, about 100 to 200 AD, there was large trade routes throughout just about all of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. It was very easy to move large amounts of goods, to quarry stone. They had lots of workers and slaves to move all of these objects, and so big works of art were much easier because the infrastructure was in place to deliver the materials that were necessary to do so. The exquisite displays of the emotions of anguish and fear and loathing and all of these that we see in these copy artists really show a glimpse of the human condition as experienced from a person looking at these ideas. This would sort of become reversed, as the Byzantines were just about always a Christian center and they wanted to fight back against what they saw as old pagan ways, but they still wanted to continue the artistic traditions and continue to accumulate knowledge and expertise, techne and mimesis. These were still concepts that were very familiar to the Greeks and that were very important in their crafting of their arts. Because again, it's important to remember they didn't have the concepts of fine art that we do today. So for them, the act of being disciplined in a specific regard, techne, and the act of making something that comes as close to pulling out a concept of real feeling as a real object would, mimesis, were their technical standards. The focus on pain, anguish, and hardship of the raw human condition was a staple of the old Roman pagan way, and the new Christian wanted to sort of separate. They didn't want to have these backgrounds, they didn't want their subjects to be a representation of something that you could see in real life. As the Pax Romana came to an end and life became more and more difficult, it's sort of interesting. In this period, the Romans were doing well, and they saw their art as an extension of the human condition of pain and suffering. And so while they were doing well themselves, their art showed signs of hardship and anger and pain. And as society began to decline, and as people died, and as things began to become really bad during the Byzantine period, art took on a more lofty, I guess you could say, conception, in that it was no longer a down-to-earth, picturesque reflection of one person feeling one thing. It was now a sort of far-away concept. They began to put their mosaics on these golden backgrounds, on these foil backgrounds, to show that they weren't in any one place. They were in a sort of ethereal nowhereness. The Byzantines' rise in these new arts and mosaics and fabrics came to actually replace their sculpture. They sort of didn't have it wasn't that they didn't have the technical skill, it was that they didn't have the necessary supply routes and trades and stability that would have been needed to make these great works. But on the other hand, a mosaic could take a very long time, it could take a lot of specialty and expertise, and it would have been just as intensive, but it was made from small materials rather than large. So as they began to move from looking at the individual and how they are affected by their society and by the condition of being alive, they began to drive more towards representations of ideals, of nobility, of courage, of hope, of love, that weren't actually there in the real world, but were that concepts that should be striven for by any person.